This series, Crash and Burn, Rise and Recover, has really been a series focused on a lot of biblical warnings that we can read about how to crash and burn in our lives. We've talked about it in terms of wealth in our lives, not just money, but relational kind of wealth and resources in our lives. We've talked about it in terms of relationships, some warnings about the Bible gives us how to crash and burn in relationships. And most of us have experienced that in our life, one way or another. We found ourselves making bad choices, and some of us are just one bad decision away from ruining everything, and we get that. And yet God's grace helps us overcome our own human failures. And you'll find that often in our lives, I've found this, I guess I'll say in my life, that my areas of greatest desperation have become my places of greatest dependence upon God. And so as we looked last week at temptation and addiction, we talked about how many things in our lives can wrap tentacles around us, and that whatever the surface addiction is, whether it's a relationship or a chemical, a substance, an experience, it's the core of who we are that is broken. And so I'm really excited this morning as we finish this series. I've invited my friend, Rob Decker, in. He's also probably most well-known around here as one of the Sanctuary Church misfits on the softball team. But anyway, he has a tremendous story, and I think you're just going to experience a lot of hope and faith in your life, just hearing how God has redeemed his life. So without further ado, let's give it up for Rob.
For sure. Are we good? Now we good? We're okay? All right. Before we get started, I just want to, there's somebody out there right now, and this is crazy because I've never done anything of the sorts. While I was in worship, I got a vision of a young woman, maybe late 20s, early 30s, Hispanic looking, or maybe you just have a stellar tan. I don't know. But you were rushing out of your house this morning, and something almost prevented you from getting here. So I'm hoping that you're here, and I'm hoping that we get to see you by the end of the service so that we can pray for you because you're going through a whole lot of stuff. I also want to say that when I share my testimony, a lot of times my wife doesn't get enough kudos. I love my wife, and she's a big reason for my sobriety. She is the person, thank you. She is the person that God used to draw me away from that lifestyle. I'll talk about my parents, my mother and my father. My mother, she was raped, beaten, thrown into foster homes, got pregnant with me. She was an outcast in her family. She was highly drug addicted for many years, but she's been about 2 years sober. And so, Mom, if you're watching, I know sometimes it's hard. I tell my testimony and I don't get to highlight certain things. And my father, he couldn't beat it. And I lost him last year to a drug overdose. He was going to his oxygen machine in the bathroom, and the drugs got a hold of him and killed him. And I love my father very much. And so I'm up here testifying as a witness to the things that I saw in my house growing up. And I don't look at my parents as bad people. I look at them as people that were afflicted by drugs and alcohol and demons in their childhood, and they couldn't conquer it. So it's not to ever make anyone look bad at all anywhere in my story. So back to my story, or starting with my testimony. My mom was the oldest of 5 kids. She grew up in a house where my grandpa cheated on my grandma. He did drugs. He drank. My mom got beaten and raped by family members, eventually got kicked out of the house, went foster home to foster home, and eventually got pregnant. She was encouraged to have an abortion, and my mom just wasn't going to do that. 6 months after having me, she met my dad, the guy that I thought was my dad, and the guy that I'll refer to as my dad because he raised me. Met my dad, my mom gets pregnant, has my sister, they get married. So you can see the direction that this is already going in. Definitely two people that probably shouldn't have been together unless they invited the Lord into their life and things changed. But from very early on, there was great separation between me and my sister because my sister belonged to my father and I was the other kid. So from a very early age, there was that sense of that, but no more than when I graduated kindergarten, came home with a diploma, and it had my dad's last name on it. And my dad's mother, my grandmother, didn't like that. I wasn't one of them, I wasn't their blood. And so that day I found out dad wasn't dad, sister wasn't my full sister, and I was to change my last name. So I got separated at a very young age. I do remember, though, that when I left that conversation, for whatever reason, because I didn't grow up in a religious house, that I walked away and I was walking down the street, and I said, it's okay, because God is my Father, and I'll be okay. I can't tell you where I got that. I'm going to give kudos to the Holy Spirit for even bringing that back to remembrance for me. As time went on, I saw a lot of drugs in my home, a lot of violence, a lot of anger. I grew up, all right, so I'm 41, and it's going to shock some of you. It's just going to but I grew up in the 80s and 90s where, you know, when the cops got called on my dad for abusing my mother, he'd leave for an hour or two and post bail and come back home, and the party'd keep going, right? And so that's kind of the generation I grew up in. And I saw that over and over and over again. And, you know, through middle school, and then eventually we get to high school, and then something just changes in me. You know, I was kind of a little bit more reserved kid. You know, I got labeled with ADD and being disconnected at times, but it was a coping mechanism for what I saw in the home. And when I became a freshman in high school, things started to change a little bit. And I started acting out a little more. And I remember this young man picking on me in medals class. And I just wasn't going to get picked on. And I waited for the perfect moment to wait for that guy to go to the front of class. And I was just going to mollywop that guy. And I mollywopped that guy. And that earned me a form of respect that I was trying to attain in my house. And so I became that guy. I became the guy that was vocal and loud and obnoxious and wanted to fight all the time. And then I got introduced to drugs and alcohol. And all that did was perpetuated any negative behavior that I could have possibly had inside of me. I used it as medication, and eventually it became addiction. And in my high school tenure, I was suspended at least 7, 8 times, visited juvenile hall 2 times, had a shotgun pulled out on me 1 time, had the opportunity to meet my biological father, who, when I walked in on him, was smoking the glass pipe. My mother and father went their separate ways. My mom was strung out. My dad was strung out, but my dad was like super responsible about being strung out. Like he was like good about it. He could still hold a job. Like if you can be, he was able to maintain a job, but he had a girlfriend, so they're married. He has a girlfriend, mom has a boyfriend. Mom's off doing her thing, dad's off doing his thing. And my sister and I are left alone in this house to ourselves with no food, no electricity. And it just kind of became the spot where all the neighborhood kids came and caused ruckus. Well, eventually, we got kicked out of that situation. So now that I'm out of that environment, I was fortunate to meet some people that really cared about me. They loved me a lot. They brought me in. And but I still had my issues. And at this point, I'm like 3 years into my addictions. And anytime I had any kind of challenge in my life, I would just run to those things. So through my 20s, I started getting into deeper drugs, drinking a lot more alcohol because I felt like more is better, right? If you have any addicts in here, more is always better. And I'm to a place where I'm always blacking out and falling all over the place and getting in a bunch of fights. And I'll tell you this, all the legal trouble I've ever been in, there was drugs and alcohol, and it was there. Never, when I was sober, did I get in any kind of trouble, didn't want to deal with it. In my late 20s, I ended up getting a job at a gym. And there was this dude there who was always trying to preach Jesus to me. And I kind of just like shook him. He was a cool dude, but I kind of blew him off and like, this Jesus thing isn't for me. Cool, it's for you, man. And he kept plugging at me. And at that time, I also met this young lady. And right out the gate, I just knew it was a super bad idea. But I went with it anyway because at this point in my life, I needed more drugs, I needed more chaos, I needed more disruptive relationships just to get stimulation, because it's always about stimulation. And we dated for a little while, and it became violent. And at that point, I decided, that it was better to go separate ways. Well, when we did, she became a prostitute. So when I was growing up, like, I feel like I'm so old. Back in my days, Craigslist, this thing called Craigslist. But there was escorting on Craigslist. And my buddy, the pervert that he is, found her on there, and he calls me up and lets me know about her. Well, I had just recently got saved. My buddy that kept plugging at me invited me to a Bible study. And in that Bible study, we were in an air-conditioned room. And that matters because I started sweating in that air-conditioned room as they started to pray over me. And something supernatural happened that day. Fast forward back to this young lady. Well, now I have Jesus. And I find out she's doing something she shouldn't be doing. So I throw on my Jesus cape, right? And I'm going to go save her. But I was still struggling with drugs and alcohol, and there's a lot of childhood issues that I hadn't addressed. And her and I came to an agreement. And in that agreement was that she was going to start letting go of her clients. But she had this one last client. And while she was with him on their little vacation to Hawaii, she was calling me up and sending me pictures of black and blue eyes, telling me that he abused her and he raped her and took advantage of her and humiliated her. So when she came back, we really were going to focus on this relationship. Well, when she came back, I was at my buddy's house partying, and she grabs me, we head to the liquor store, grab a bottle, head to her house. Well, we get into a conversation, and it was a scary place to be. I was still struggling. She had just got raped and beaten. We've already had previous trouble in our relationship, and we get into a conversation. I decide to walk away, go to sleep down, and she lived in a 3-story loft, so I went downstairs. And I wake up to a bang on the door. And I hear, "Santa Clara Police, we know you're in there, Rob Decker, open up." I'm like, what? She comes downstairs, and I ask her what's going on, and she looks at me and she says, "Called the cops. I told them that you raped me and that you tried to kill me." And in that moment, I was so broken, I was so betrayed, I had nothing going for me, with the exception of I was still like a fetus in Christ at that time, but I was living on couches, I was selling drugs, I was doing drugs, and I had nothing going for me. And in that moment, it was like the perfect storm of events. If you collected everything from my childhood and just kind of built it up to that point to where I got accused of that, it was just the perfect storm of events. And I just looked at her and I said, "I can't do this anymore. I'm out." And I turned around with all intentions of killing myself, and I ran through that window trying to break my neck when I hit that concrete. Well, fortunately, unfortunately, I clipped an awning on the way down, changed my fall. I broke my back, shattered my arm, broke my wrist, collapsed my lung. And all I could think, and I didn't black out. I felt this whole thing. I look up at the window, and I just ask God, why? Why would you let me live? Ambulance, grab me, take me to the hospital. 10 hours surgeries. I wake up, highly medicated, back brace, external fixator, cast, tubes coming out of my neck, pumping morphine and Dilaudid. And cops walk in. You're under arrest, Mr. Decker. Shackle me to the bed. I had 24-hour surveillance in the hospital. So now I'm facing never walking again, facing going to prison. And whatever bills come with that hospital, facing that too. I'm not facing any good quality of life. One of the cops, who was, obviously didn't want to be there, he was on his phone. It looked like he was fighting with his girlfriend or something. And he had the case right next to him and thumbing through the case, and he looks up at me and says, Mr. Decker, you're a really bad guy. I'm reading this report, and you're just a really bad guy. And I start breaking down crying. I'm just like, I've done a lot of dumb stuff in my life, but that's not one of those things I would have ever done. And I cared about her. I may not have done it the right way, but I cared about that young lady. And I'm starting to break out into this big cry. Nurse comes in, she's like, you're gonna have to calm down, I can't have your blood pressure up. Like, my body was rejecting blood transfusions. It was a horrible experience. And as he's grilling me, guess who shows up? I'll give you a minute. She shows up in a disguise. And the cop looks up and he's just like, well, this doesn't make sense. And he escorts her out, and I never see her again. Later that night, I'm laying in bed, and I'm asking God, like, what are we gonna do? I have not much to look forward to at this point. Shackled to this bed, and I can't walk. So working out was the only thing I ever had. But now that was taken away from me. I can't walk. I can't sit up in my bed. I can't use the bathroom for myself. And that night, in this conversation, I get this peaceful, calming sensation. And I hear, the charges will be dropped, your bills will be paid, and you will walk again. And I doze off into this vision of playing soccer. And I hate soccer. I can't. But my wife's a soccer player, so. But yeah, I wake up and the chaos of everything is back. Well, a new cop comes in to kind of watch me, and he says, hey man, they're gonna release you in a couple days. Just wanted to give you the heads up. And I'm like, what? Seriously? Cops come in, let me go. They're just like, hey, have a good life, Mr. Decker. It's easy for you to say, right? Shortly after that, because I was under arrest in the hospital, I wasn't allowed to have visitors because basically you're locked up. You're a prisoner of the state. And my mom comes in and she's bawling her eyes out. And my mom and I had like a rough go for a really long time, actually. And I don't blame her. But she comes in and she's bawling her eyes out. And I know. They told her I was never going to walk again. And I'm just trying to get it out of her. And like, what's going on, Mom? She's like, nothing. And they told you I'm never going to walk again, right? And I was like, don't worry about it. Don't believe that. And in my mom's most sincerest of broken motherly places, she comes up to me and she says, son, I wish everything ended for you that day. And I know that she didn't want to hurt after everything she'd been through. She didn't want to see her baby boy hurt. My dad was there, but he wasn't my dad. So he was my dad, but he wasn't my dad. He took care of my sister more than he took care of me. And so my mom just felt so broken for me. And I understood that, and I received it, and I was totally okay with it. Shortly after that, nurses come in. They're like, hey, we're gonna get you to stand up. And I knew for a fact, 100%, no way, not happening. I couldn't even like roll over on my side without being in immense amounts of pain. And the vision, I had just recently seen The Passion of Christ before all this stuff too. And Isaiah 53 was one of the very first books I ever read, and it's still my favorite all time. I don't think anything's gonna change that. And I just get this vision of Christ, what he did for me on that cross, and I'm like, man, he would have did it for me. I got my mom in the room, gotta try to stand up. And I did, and it was ugly, and I squealed, and they injected me with pain medication, put me on the bed. I felt like I broke my back all over again. And they said, no, he's not walking. Surgeon comes in and says, hey, we're gonna try operating again. And I don't know if you know, like these really extensive back surgeries, you're signing a waiver basically saying, hey, every time we do this, 15% more chance that you're gonna die or end up paralyzed, you know? Yeah, write it off, let's try. And I woke up and I could move a little bit better after that surgery, and a nurse walks into the room. She goes, Mr. Decker, we're gonna try to get you to walk today. Let's go for it. So I get up out of the bed, and I can stand on this leg where I couldn't stand on it before. And I'm able to drag it. So I get into the hallway, and I'm excited because I'm like, I'm walking again. And I did this thing where I ran with this side, but only could drag this side. So I did this circle into the wall. And the nurse looked so concerned. But I was stoked. I was happy. I'm like, we're walking again. I'm going to be playing center field for the Misfits. That's what we're doing. Right? And shortly after that, I was released from the hospital. Something that God pressed on my heart while I was in the hospital was that, you know, in order for me to start healing you, you have to start forgiving. Because there was a lot of bitterness and unforgiveness in my heart, and because there's a lot of things I didn't understand. But when you're down and out for a long time and you have no other option but to think, you start to get these. And I had to forgive that young lady for those false accusations, and that was the first step of healing. Then I went to go live with my mom, and my mom was still full of junk, right? She wasn't over her past, she had her addictions. So her and I had this deal in the house, like, hey, you get my pills and you bring me alcohol. Right? Because I still need to medicate. I still don't want to feel pain. And we did that for a while. Even as crummy as that sounds, I got to know my mom by living with her for that short period of time. And I realized who she was and what she came out of, with the stories that she shared with me. And I realized that a lot of the stuff that I was given was actually passed down to her. And I remember the day my mom walked into that front door and I broke down crying because I fell in love with my mom. And I'm just like, I get you, and I love you, and thank you for having me. And that was the beginning of healing between my mom and I. In my stay there, she was also telling me stories about my dad and the things that had happened to him. Well, he was a product of my grandpa raping my grandma. And he came about, so that's something that stuck with him. There was many more things, but that was like the one big thing that stuck. So I looked at my dad, and I'm like, man, I feel sorry for you, and I get why you did those things to me. I'm not saying it was okay, but I forgive you, Dad, and I extend that grace to you. And then all of a sudden, healing with my dad came about. This process took a while. It was about 3 years into my physical recovery. I was still drinking. I was on some pain medications, but I started working out again. The Lord had really pressed on me that I needed to be active and moving, and so I started going back to the gym again. And before you knew it, like I went from 6 medications, and at this point I was down to 1 after training for some time. then the Lord really insisted, like, hey, now you're going to go into the world, and you're going to get a job, and you're going to use everything that we've been through together and all your experiences, and you're going to go share with other people, and you're going to give them hope. Like, I don't know, that's a lot to ask, Lord. Back still hurts a little bit. And but that's what happened. I ended up, and I was living off a disability too. And if anyone here has ever lived off disability, you don't live off disability. You just don't. You just don't get enough money. And I knew that I had to get off disability, and I needed to go earn a paycheck. And I got a job at a gym. And my heart was, I'm going to use fitness as a key or a tool to really enter that one-on-one personal life with people. It's all about developing those relationships. Well, while I was there was a young lady that worked there, and she was instructed to work with me or let me train her so that they could see the type of personal trainer I was. Well, guess what? I married her. No trainer has those credentials. Now she has my babies. With that, she, and I knew she was from the Lord, because I know that the very first time we went out on a date, we went to BJ's Bar and Grill, and I'm still drinking, and I order a pitcher of beer, and I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna nail that. The beer. Easy, people. And she looks at me and she goes like, I don't want any of that. I'm like, cool, it wasn't for you anyway. And it's my warm up, I'm pre-gaming, and I think I ended up nailing a couple. Doesn't matter. But I knew she didn't like it. And in that moment, I was like, this is what you're going to do, Lord? You're going to use a woman to get me to quit drinking? Yeah, sure did. I went out swinging, though. 9 months. Like, I had to birth sobriety, right? It was like a 9-month fight with this young lady. Like, we had a great relationship, but it was my alcohol that was getting in the way. And one night she just graduated college. We were in Northern California. She had just graduated college, and she started a new job. And I got behind the wheel of her car, went to a friend's house to help him move, and we started hitting the bottle. And I ended up crashing into someone's house, running from the scene of the crime, and fell into a creek and ended up under someone's house. And I laid under there and just discombobulated, and I sat there and I was like trying to negotiate with the Lord, like negotiate with God. The same God that gave me my body back and got me off all this pain medication, got me off of disability, let me go into the world again, right, and share an awesome story about how awesome He is and all this healing He does, and I'm still messing around and hitting the bottle. And I'm under that house, and I'm pleading with Him. I said, Lord, if you can bail me out of this situation, which you don't have to, you're just, and I deserve all the consequences in the world, I will move to Southern California, where Alyssa's originally from. I will marry that woman. This has to be your will. I'm going to marry that woman, and I promise I'll never touch the juice again. Long story short, he bailed me out. There's a lot that unfolded in that story, but basically he bailed me out. We moved to Southern California, and I have not had the desire to drink ever again. And I think that under that house that night, I was so overwhelmed with His goodness and His grace, and just realizing that He gave me so much back and that I was just throwing it away. It just prevented me to ever go back. And I was ready for the withdrawal and all that kind of stuff. And praise God, I never had to go through that situation. And I know that's not the situation for everybody, but I'm very grateful that that was part of my healing process. We're in Southern California. We get married. for our honeymoon, instead of Hawaii, Colorado Springs, baby. The Lord pressed on her heart that this is where we were going to move. And 5, 3, 4, I'm not a numbers guy. I count reps. That's all I can. You're lifting that 5 times, go. But that we were going to pay off some, and that we were going to move out here to Colorado Springs and raise our family. And so, we get here, and this place is amazing, even though a lot of us from California are like stealing your shine. Just like a third of you are from California, right? And we were able to, together, start a family, buy a home, and create this ministry. Again, I use fitness as a tool to help others. And my heart is to not just train the physical heart, but to really dig deep and to draw people closer to someone that's really close to me. And that's where we're at nowadays. I do want to share, because I understand Dr. E or Easy-E, Dr. Dre, freaking the original NWA over here. His heart for the lost and the broken, because I share in that. People that struggle with drugs and alcohol, because I share in that. Abuse, because I share in that. I love his heart and what he's doing here in the Springs. And I just pray that we can continue to draw those individuals that other churches don't receive so well. You're not a reject. I'm just saying, they reject you, but I love his heart, and I love what he's doing here, and I hope and I pray that Kingdom Fit is more than just fitness and can do something very similar. I have lost so many loved ones to drugs and alcohol, depression, suicide, all things that I was connected to. My buddy Will, I walked in on the aftermath of him popping pills and putting a shotgun to his head, and I had to witness that. My buddy Mark, pain medication and alcohol, done. My pops, which is my mom's boyfriend, hit the bottle, smoked a lot of weed, done, had a heart attack. My dad, meth, done. My uncle got behind the wheel, meth and alcohol, done. So my heart goes out to anyone in here who is struggling with addiction, because someone today is going to be freed of that. In Jesus' name. With that said, if anybody in here needs prayer healing from myself or anybody on the team, we're readily available for you, because there's nothing more satisfying for some of us than to watch people get free from addiction and bondage and struggles and lies of the enemy, because that's all it really is. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to a message from the Sanctuary Church. For more information and media, go to our website at thesanctuarywestside.org or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube.